One of the most watched people on the internet sat down in a stadium in Miami wearing a Cape Verde jersey to watch his team play Argentina at the World Cup. His name is Darren Watkins Jr., but the world knows him as iShowSpeed, a streamer with tens of millions of followers, broadcasting live to a global audience in real time. And somewhere behind him in the stands, an Argentine fan leaned in and, on camera, told him to go home. According to the reports that followed, the man also told him, in Spanish, to go cry at the zoo, to the zoo, as if this black man in the crowd were an animal that had wandered out of its enclosure. Speed's reaction became its own moment. He didn't rage, he didn't swing, he just made a little barking gesture, a kind of stunned, sarcastic acknowledgement, and turned back to the game. Millions of people saw it. FIFA opened an investigation and put out a statement condemning racism in all its forms. The fan denied he'd meant anything by it, and almost immediately, online, the conversation became bigger than one heckler. Because a lot of people asked the same question: why this reaction from these fans in this country? And the answer, it turns out, runs back more than 200 years into one of the strangest and most deliberate acts of national forgetting in the modern world. Because here's the thing about Argentina that most people never learn. Today, it thinks of itself and is often described as the most European country in Latin America, a nation where, by its own census, something like 9 in 10 people claim European descent. There's even an old, ugly saying you'll hear repeated there, that there are no black people in Argentina. A former president, Carlos Menem, once said it almost exactly like that. "Black people don't exist in Argentina," he said. "That's Brazil's problem." But that is not history. That is a story Argentina told itself. And to understand the heckler in the Miami stands, you have to understand how a country that was once genuinely deeply black managed to convince itself and the world that it never was. So let's rewind. Go back to the early 1800s, to the port city of Buenos Aires, and you would not have seen a white European city at all. You'd have seen an Atlantic slave port. For 2.5 centuries, Spanish ships had carried enslaved Africans across the ocean into the Rio de la Plata, and by the first decades of the 19th century, the population of Buenos Aires was somewhere around 30% black. In some provinces to the north, people of African descent made up close to half the population. This was not a small minority hidden in the corners. This was a third of the capital, and Black Argentines were woven into everything. They did the labor that built the city, the docks, the households, the workshops, the trades. They were artisans and soldiers and street vendors and washerwomen, and they built the culture. That thing Argentina is most famous for in all the world, the tango, has deep roots in Black Argentine music and dance, in the drumming and the gatherings of exactly these communities. The word tango itself, the rhythms of the milonga, the candombe drumming brought from Africa. This is the soil the Argentine soul grew out of. Black people weren't at the edge of Argentine identity. They were near the center of it. They even helped win the country's freedom. When Argentina fought for its independence from Spain, and later in its wars across the continent, black men filled the ranks of the army. The famous liberating campaigns were carried, in large part, on the backs of black and mixed-race soldiers. Many of them promised freedom in exchange for their service. Freedom that often meant being sent to the deadliest positions on the battlefield. So how do you get from there, a capital that's a third black, a culture built on African roots, to a country that, a century later, would shrug and say, "Black people don't exist here"? The honest answer is that it happened through several forces at once, and it's important to be precise about them, because the popular version overstates some and ignores others. Part of it was real, brutal death. In the 1860s, Argentina fought a catastrophic war against Paraguay, the deadliest war in South American history, and Black Argentine men were conscripted and sent to the front in numbers far out of proportion to their share of the population. Many never came home. Then, in 1871, a yellow fever epidemic tore through Buenos Aires, and it hit the poor, crowded Black neighborhoods the hardest, because that's what epidemics do. They follow poverty. Families that were already thinned by war were thinned again by disease. Those things are true. But here's where you have to be careful, because for a long time this was the whole story Argentina told, that the Black population simply, tragically died off in wars and plagues, through no one's real fault, and historians who've actually dug into the census records say, that's not what happened, not on its own. The wars and the fever were real, but they were nowhere near enough to erase a third of a city. Something else was going on. Something deliberate. That something was a national project. In the middle of the 19th century, the men building modern Argentina looked at their country and decided what they wanted it to become. And it was white. Europe, transplanted to South America. Influential thinkers like Juan Bautista Alberdi preached that to govern is to populate, and by populate, they meant with Europeans specifically. Domingo Sarmiento, a founding father, a president, the man whose face has been on the money and whose name is on the schools, framed the whole future of the country as a war between what he called civilization and barbarism. And in his mind, civilization meant white and European, and barbarism meant everyone who wasn't. So Argentina threw its doors open. Over a few decades around the turn of the 20th century, more than 4 million European immigrants, Italians, Spaniards, and others, poured into the country. It was one of the largest waves of immigration anywhere on Earth. And it was, in part, by design, a conscious effort to flood the nation with white Europeans until the existing population, the Black and mixed and indigenous population, was simply outnumbered, diluted, absorbed. And that word, absorbed, is the key to the whole thing, because the last mechanism, and maybe the most important one, wasn't a battlefield or a fever. It was a pen. It was paperwork. Argentina, quite literally, counted its Black population out of existence. Over the 19th century, the racial categories in the censuses and the church records started to blur and shift. People who would have been recorded as Negro, Black, got reclassified into softer, vaguer categories. Pardo, trigueño, which means wheat-colored. A word elastic enough to cover a dark-skinned European or a light-skinned African and quietly erase the difference. Mixed-race children, through generations of intermarriage, were folded upward into whiteness on paper. And then, crucially, the national census simply stopped asking about race at all after the 1880s. If you don't count a people, then in the cold logic of the state, they cease to exist. You haven't killed them. You've just stopped writing them down. Put all of that together, the disproportionate war deaths, the epidemic, the deliberate flood of European immigration, generations of intermarriage, and a state that reclassified and then uncounted an entire population. And you get the trick. Argentina's Black population didn't vanish in a puff of smoke. It was partly killed, partly diluted, and very deliberately erased from the records and from the national story, until the country could look in the mirror and honestly believe it had always been white. By 1887, the black share of Buenos Aires had officially dropped from around 30% to under 2%. And the myth hardened into concrete. Generations of Argentine schoolchildren grew up learning, in effect, that their country was a piece of Europe that had drifted across the Atlantic, that blackness was something that belonged somewhere else, to Brazil, to the Caribbean, to the United States, anywhere but home. And here's a detail that ought to sit uncomfortably next to all of this. The whole project was sold as bringing in the best of European civilization, culture, science, progress, the civilization Sarmiento worshipped. But the criterion was never actually character or decency or worth. The criterion was skin, whiteness. And if you want to see what a country really believes, watch who it's willing to take in and who it's willing to protect. Because the doors that were flung open to Europeans in the 1800s never really closed. And after the Second World War, Argentina used them to let in some of the most wanted men on earth. When the Nazi regime collapsed in 1945, its war criminals needed somewhere to run. And they found a friend in Argentina, and specifically in its president, Juan Perón. Perón thought the Nuremberg trials, the trials of the men who ran the Holocaust, were a disgrace. His government helped organize what became known as the rat lines, the escape routes that smuggled Nazis out of Europe, out through Italy and Spain, on falsified Red Cross papers, and across the Atlantic to Buenos Aires. Perón even put an open anti-Semite in charge of immigration. Historians estimate that as many as 5,000 Nazis and collaborators slipped into Argentina, and not minor figures. Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, the man who organized the logistics of mass murder, lived quietly outside Buenos Aires for years under a false name, until Israeli agents snatched him off a street in 1960. Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor who performed monstrous experiments on prisoners, lived in Argentina too. Erich Priebke, responsible for a massacre in Italy, settled in the pretty Alpine-style town of Bariloche and lived there, in plain sight, for almost 50 years. Sit with that contrast for a second. This is a country that had spent a century erasing its own black population from the record because they didn't fit the image of a white European nation, and then turned around and rolled out the welcome mat for Europe's literal war criminals because they did. That's the whole ugly logic laid bare. It was never about being good. It was only ever about being white. Now, I want to be fair and precise here, because this is the kind of story that's easy to flatten. Present-day Argentina is not some uniquely evil place, and not every Argentine carries this in their heart. The country is also home to people fighting hard to recover this buried history, and there's a genuine complication in how race even works there. The word Negro in Argentina got twisted into something as much about class as color, hurled at poor, darker-skinned working-class Argentines of mixed and indigenous descent, the people sometimes sneeringly called cabecitas negras, little black heads. So the racism is real, but it's tangled, part anti-black, part anti-indigenous, part class contempt, all braided together by that same old dream of a white European nation. But here's what doesn't go away. When you spend a century and a half teaching a country that black people are foreign, that they're not part of us, that they belong in some other place, you are planting something, and eventually it grows. Which brings us back around to the football. Because this didn't stay in the 19th century. In 2022, Argentina won the World Cup, and in the celebrations, a chant started spreading through the fans and, astonishingly, into the national team itself. In the summer of 2024, After Argentina won the Copa America, one of their biggest stars, Enzo Fernández, a Chelsea player, a hero of that World Cup win, live-streamed himself and his teammates on the team bus singing it. And the song mocked the French national team. Its lyrics jeered that France's players play for France, but their parents are from Angola, that their mothers are from Cameroon, their fathers from Nigeria, but their passport says French. In other words, you're not really French, you're African. You don't belong to the nation whose shirt you wear. Sit with that, right next to everything we just talked about. It is the exact same idea. It is the myth of the white nation set to music. The belief that blackness and national belonging can't occupy the same body, that a black man in a French shirt is a fraud, and a black man in a Cape Verde shirt in a Miami stadium should go home. Go to the zoo. Go back where you came from. The fallout was real. The French Football Federation filed a legal complaint. Chelsea opened a disciplinary investigation into their own player. Enzo Fernández apologized and said there was no excuse for the words, that he'd been caught up in the euphoria. And back in Argentina, the whole thing detonated into politics. When a government official suggested the team's captain should apologize, Argentina's president had that official fired instead. The country, in other words, could not even agree that the chant was something to be sorry for. And then, 2 years later, iShowSpeed sat down in that stadium in his green Cape Verde jersey, and a man behind him told him to go cry at the zoo. You see how it connects. The heckler in Miami almost certainly never read a 19th century census. He probably couldn't tell you who Domingo Sarmiento was, or what happened to the black neighborhoods of Buenos Aires in the yellow fever summer of 1871. He didn't need to. He inherited the conclusion without ever having to learn the argument. He grew up in a country that quietly decided, generations before he was born, that black people were a thing that happened somewhere else. And so when one appeared, cheering for the wrong team, the reflex was already loaded and waiting. You don't belong here. That's what erasure does. It doesn't just delete the past. It shapes the present in people who have no idea they're carrying it. But I'll leave you with the other half of the picture, because it matters. That old lie, that there are no black people in Argentina, is finally starting to crack. In 2010, for the first time in generations, the Argentine census asked people again whether they were of African descent, and well over 100,000 said yes, and researchers think the true number is far higher, buried under all those decades of uncounting. Afro-Argentine activists are digging their ancestors back out of the archives, reclaiming the tango and the candombe drums, insisting on a history their own country tried to file away. The people were never actually gone. They were just told they were. And maybe that's the quiet lesson under this whole strange story. The reason a heckler in Miami became a conversation about a war in the 1860s. You can rewrite a census. You can flood a country with immigrants and change its color on paper. You can teach children a flattering myth for 100 years, but you cannot actually make a people disappear. They're still there, in the music, in the blood, in the archives, in the face of a man in a green jersey who barked back at the crowd and refused to leave. The story Argentina told itself is finally coming undone, and slowly, a country that worked for a century and a half to forget its own black history is being made, at last, to remember it. Thank you again, and as always, for sitting with me in the quiet dark. Be sure to like and hit the subscribe button on your way out.